Sometimes we miss the mark. As we talked about last week, we may miss it by that much. We may miss it by a lot. Even when we are trying to do that which is good, we can still mess things up. Even the things we care the most about. And like Isaiah, all we can say is, "Woe is me, for I am lost." Confession. Naming our failure, acknowledging when we mess up and miss the mark, it's important. But the gospel never stops there. Isaiah confesses, and angels bring burning coals to his lips to cleanse, to heal, to redeem. It's a metaphor of purifying his life, a work of grace to make right that which Isaiah can't make right. When I was in college, some friends were in the midst of a prank war, and I decided that seems fun. Let me jump into that and help out. So we larded a couple of our friends' cars and then wrapped them in saran wrap. So what you do is you take pure lard and you smear it all over the car, and then you wrap it in saran wrap. Now, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but we didn't really think about how hard lard fat is to get off, because you can't just rinse that stuff off, and how it could damage a car if it just sat there. We messed up. And so the next day, we spent all day scraping off the lard with little plastic squeegees and cleaning those cars. Sometimes we mess up, and if we can fix things, we should. It's not enough to say, "Well, gosh, sorry about that, my bad." No. When the wrong is ours, we should do everything we can to fix it. But there are times when we fall short, when we mess things up and we can't make it right. We leave things too broken to repair. All we can say is, "Woe is me, for I am lost." Scripture tells us this story of Peter's denial. It's a stunning story of failure. Here, Peter, the rock, the one who is called to deny himself and follow Jesus, instead denies Jesus and follows his fears. This is probably one of the worst moments of Peter's life. And the gospel writers have written it down to make sure we all remember. Luke turns the camera to this moment of failure because he can't tell the story of grace without it. Peter was following Jesus. Following is what a disciple is called to do. You may remember the very first thing Jesus said to Peter, "Come and follow me." So when Jesus walked up the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter followed. When Jesus walked by the sea, Peter followed him. When Jesus walked on the sea, Peter followed him. More on that next week. It's what a disciple does. But Peter was following at a distance. But don't think of it in terms of geography. The distance is not measured in feet or yards or miles. The distance is found in the heart. Distance allows Peter to maintain some control, to be in, but not all in. He follows at a distance because he's afraid. He follows, but at a distance because he has his doubts. I love the honesty of this story. We so often follow at a distance. We love at a distance. We participate at a distance because we're scared and we want to maintain some control over things. We want an out, an excuse. We sometimes doubt our direction and path and maybe even who we're following. I think too often faith is presented as belief or non-belief, in or out, yes or no. But that's not really the truth of it, is it? I don't know that many folks who believe or don't believe. Mostly I know folks who struggle to believe, who want to but just can't quite get there. They hold fragile faith, growing faith, withering faith, battered faith, striving faith, searching faith. We believe, help our unbelief. We follow the gospel life, but often we follow at a distance. Does that make sense to you? Following at a distance, Peter swears he does not know what we know he knows. It was the worst moment of his life, for he has just messed up the relationship he cares the most about, and he can't fix it. And Luke tells us in this moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. The words of denial still in his mouth, his eyes meet the eyes of Christ. Can you imagine that look? Take a moment and picture it. Maybe you're picturing a look your mom or your dad gave you when they caught you and they know you messed up. Maybe it's a look your spouse has given you when you said something you shouldn't have said. Maybe it's even a look you've given your children. Do you have that look? Maybe it's a look that says, I know you. I know the truth of you. You cannot hide. No wonder Peter runs away and weeps. Can I share with you one of my greatest fears? Is that my mic will be left on or turned on early and I'll say something careless or go to the restroom. Take note, AV team. Marie used to always turn her mic on and off herself because she just couldn't leave it in the hands of someone else. I get it. That's a lot of trust. I get that, especially after hearing the story of my friend Charlie. Charlie was preparing to preach one Sunday, and somehow his mic was switched on. He didn't have the luxury of an AV team that muted and unmuted him when needed. If he was on, and he didn't know he was on. Before the service, one of the elders came to him to tell him a certain couple was back who had left the church angry a few years before. They had a reputation of being at a church for a while, getting angry, leaving, and finding another church. Charlie said, "Great. No one was too sad to see them leave. They switched churches more than the Browns switched quarterbacks. I guess they got fed up with every other church in town, and we're back in the rotation." After that, he went to the restroom before the service began, and the microphone had really good range. Everyone in the sanctuary lifted their heads to watch the speakers like people in an elevator look at numbers. Only when he stepped into the sanctuary did he realize that he had been broadcasting live and in person. They had heard his careless comments, and they had heard, well, they heard him. It was more than he could take. He resigned the next week. You know, with today's technology, imagine your worst moments being caught on film and put on the internet for all to see. Imagine the most careless thing you've said out there for everyone. The things you said in a moment of frustration or anger. It's kind of terrifying, isn't it? I think it's terrifying because we don't want to be fully known. Our worst moments, how we are when we're upset, when we're angry, when we're scared. We prefer an online presence that we can curate rather than the whole heart to be known. Peter did not have that luxury, and we often don't either, with so much of our lives able to be recorded with or without our knowledge. In his worst moment, Jesus turns and looks at Peter. I've often assumed that the look Jesus gives Peter is a look of shame, a look of disappointment. But there's another way to interpret this moment. Perhaps there's something else taking place. More than judgment, when Jesus turns and looks to this stumbling, failing disciple who only follows at a distance, it seems to me that Jesus bridges that distance. He crosses the gap that Peter cannot cross. The look of Jesus is not so much a look of judgment as it is a look of grace. The look of Jesus dissolves the distance. Jesus says to Peter, I know the worst moment in your life, and I still refuse to give up on you. When you cannot come to me, I will come to you. My grace will not leave you behind. There is no failure in you that will cause me to let go of you. Grace is not some sweet attribute of God. Grace is the tenacious faithfulness of God as God holds on to us in the very moment when we give God every good reason to let go. In grace, God knows the worst in us and holds on to the best in us. That's the story of the gospel. That's the story of my life, the story of faith, and it's the best story. It's a story that's hard for us to live for a variety of reasons. Sometimes hurts can't just be easily fixed. Sometimes it's not healthy for us to never give up. But it's good to know that God is bigger than all of that. God will never give up on us. My freshman year of college, my friend Whit and I were driving home one weekend after helping out at a camp in the mountains of North Carolina. I was in my old black Jeep Cherokee, and he was in his white pickup truck, and it had started to snow. We made it to I-40, and when I was changing lanes, my car slipped and I did a 360 in the highway. Luckily, I wasn't hit, and it was then I remembered I had four-wheel drive. I should probably turn that on. Whit had passed me while I spun out and pulled over to engage the four-wheel drive. About 5 miles down the road, I came upon a pile of cars. He was in the middle of it. Now, this was a day when most people didn't have cell phones, but I had one of those giant flip phones that, like, are this big. I had it for emergency, so I gave it to Whit to call his mom. I don't know how it is that moms can tell something is wrong, but they can. He just said, Mom, and she said, tell me where you are. I'll be right there. She didn't say, what did you do this time, Whit? There was no, I've told you to be more careful. Do you have any idea how this will affect your insurance? No anger, no disappointment. Whit said he was shocked when he hung up the phone. He thought he'd get the angry or the disappointed speech. None of that. I'm not saying they didn't have that conversation later, but at the moment, it was just, tell me where you are. I'll be right there. Grace is like that. When we have messed it up and we can't make it right, God says, tell me where you are. I'll be right there. The reason Luke tells this story is because it's our story. I don't know your worst moment. I don't want to. But know the eyes of Christ see us. It's a look that says, I know you. I know the whole truth of you. And that gaze closes the distance we create. No distance is so far that we fall beyond the gaze of our Savior. He looks at us and dissolves the distance. No matter how far we think we've run or tried to hide or isolate ourselves from God, God is always looking, wanting to close that gap. Grace is not some sweet attribute of God. Grace is the tenacious faithfulness of God as God holds on to us in the very moment when we give God every good reason to let us go. In grace, God knows the worst in us, and God still holds on to the best in us. And that is the story of faith, and I thank God for it.